Hello, this is Mad Cat, the angry egalitarian that discusses this and that. And today is a special day. It is International Boys Day. And today I'm going to be doing something very special. It is International Boys. Fuck you. So today is International Boys Day, and I'm going to be doing something very special. I'm going to be reading excerpts from my book. And the reason I'm doing this is the first part of my book deals directly with children, specifically boys. And a lot of what I see out there today still, people are slowly opening up that males need help, but still not to a great degree. And boys especially. They're basically in an internment camp, which is known as our modern education system, where they are told almost every single day that they are villains of society, that their gender is what's causing all of the problems, and they have no choice but to basically give in. And so that's why I really want to do this, and why my book exists in the first place is we really need to get out there and explain the problems because so many people just don't know. Would you like to? Well, I'm joined today with Mike Buchanan. Sorry, this is a little impromptu. This is not really an interview, so I haven't had a guest in a while. How are you doing, Mike? You're muted, sir.
Yes, I'm great. Thank you, Chris, and it's really good to be here.
Okay. So, for those who don't know, I am writing a book called Boys and Men's Issues Handbook. And remember that boys has the apostrophe after the S, not before it.
Well, it depends on the context, of course, but let's move on.
So, I actually was in a discussion last night about abuses that boys suffered, and there was just some male feminist troll who looked at some of the resources I have, which we will see today, and they were just completely dismissive of it. They even went on to say that the high rate of mothers being abusers is because men are not being properly reported. And so I'm kind of happy I'm doing this now. Not that I think he'll watch, but it'll give me a chance to kind of explain why he was incorrect in most of his assumptions. But I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share. And hopefully you can see that. Now, I am still working on this book. The first book is going to focus on children and education. Hold on, there we go. I'm going to close this out, but as you can see, there's quite a bit that I've done already, and I'm still got a ways to go, but I'm still pushing very hard. It's why I haven't really done videos lately. And Mike, I encourage you to jump in at any time, and if you want to comment on something, feel free. Okay, so
Chris, I'm sorry. Is it possible to take off? I'm not sure what you call it. You know the symbol to the right of children. I don't know what that's it. Perfect. Thank you very much.
I'm so used to that. I don't really see it anymore. But if it's off, I notice. All right, so I'm going to jump around here. I'm not going to read everything, but I'll start off with this introduction to children because I really enjoy it. The 1977 hit song, The Greatest Love of All, first line reads as follows: I believe the children are our future. It's a good sentiment. The children of today will grow and control the world of tomorrow. However, if we look at the children of today and see how they are treated, we might need to change the lyrics to, I believe girls are our future. However, if we look at the children of today and see how they are treated, we need to mute the lyrics to I believe girls are our future. However, awesome. So I'll read the last sentence. However, if we look at the children of today and see how they are treated, we might need to change the lyrics to I believe girls are our future. To be a boy today is to be born with the sin of being born with a penis. Everything that I enjoyed as a young boy is taken away from boys today. In its place is the idea that the only thing permissible in boys is what is good for girls.
Chris, I'm getting
taken away from boys today.
I'm getting an appalling double audio track.
That the only thing okay, it's a little weird. In its place is the idea that the only thing permissible for boys is what is good for girls. That might sound like a hyperbole, but it's not. I'm being quite serious. When we get into the next section about education, a talking point there will be that boys are treated as defective girls. That anything a boy might like to do is restricted, and he is demonized for liking it. And the school will remind him that his gender is responsible for all the atrocities in the world, and it is his gender that have held women back and have done bad things to women, and each boy needs to give up their privilege in order to compensate girls today for the crimes of yesterday. Gee, no wonder why so many boys claim to be girls. And I referenced that fairly recent assembly in Australia where boys were forced to stand up and apologize to all women. So as you can see, I'm just constantly doing research. Okay, so I'm going to skip past this and I'm going to talk about abduction. This isn't an issue that's really talked about in our movement today, and I think we should expand upon this. I'm not going to read too much of this, but interesting thing here is despite how often the media reports on stranger danger, the rate of stranger abduction is actually quite low, representing 1% of total abductions in the United States. It is believed, though, that only men abduct children they don't know, often girls for the purpose of molestation. So let's talk about female perpetrators. And the most interesting case that I saw on female perpetrators of abduction was a woman named Georgia Tan. In 1924, she was able to coerce mothers into giving up their child, and in some instances, kidnapping children to be sold to other people, including celebrities such as Joan Crawford. It is estimated that by 1950, she had a profit of $1 million, which is equivalent to $10 million today. I'm sure many of you will point out that the black market adoptions were not illegal at the time. So technically, she didn't break any laws. However, her practices did launch an investigation and led to laws being created. It does seem, however, she did not focus on one gender over the other. So you might ask, well, what does that really have to do with boys if it affected both? Well, see, as I read before, there's this perception that it's just men who abduct children. And yet we have a very famous case of a woman kidnapping thousands or hundreds of thousands of children. And yet I only found out about this when I started researching abductions. I've never heard anyone else ever talk about this.
Chris, I don't know if you go on to talk about fathers' denial of access to children, but in a sense, that's state-sanctioned child abduction, and overwhelmingly initiated by mothers, of course.
Yes, very much so. I guess I should point out that when I use abduction here, I'm talking about non-custodial abduction. But custodial abduction, I actually have so much on that.
and,
which
and, the,
might
and
be featured. Go ahead.
no, so and the scale of that must utterly dwarf, the area you're talking about here. I mean, probably thousands fold, I would think. And it's state sanctioned, taxpayer funded.
Yes, very much so. Children being denied access to their fathers, or rather, fathers being denied access to their children. And then we get into the issue of parent alienation, and that the court sanctions this. That if a woman says anything bad about her husband, the courts won't do anything about it. And even feminists will go on to say that it doesn't actually exist. It's just a tactic for fathers to continue to abuse their wife and children. So another instance of women abducting children is actually Queen Elizabeth I. And we talk about state-sanctioned abductions. This is a case for that, because Queen Elizabeth I allowed for boys to be kidnapped and forced to work in theaters to perform for audiences. The theaters were given licenses for this practice, taking boys off the street and threatening violence on them should they not obey, i.e., whipping. This was not only considered legal, but there were blocks that prevented parents from retrieving their sons. There are also indications that boys were required to perform sexually explicit plays, and since boys played the parts of females, that meant that they were raped or otherwise sexually abused. In fairness, this was likely a common practice during this era and not specific to Queen Elizabeth, and I would like to see more research done in this area. Given that this is your backyard, do you have any thoughts or insights?
This is the first I've heard of this, Chris. So your research is pretty deep. Of course, I mean, kidnappings also happened of men to for the Royal Navy in particular.
Surprisingly, I got this from a BBC news source.
Wow, someone must have been fired over that. Someone must have been fired over that.
So, going into other abductions, one thing I try to do. I mean, I'm very much hello, Uncanny X-Men. Obviously, I'm American-centric, and so a lot of my research will be centered in America, but I do try to go across the world to see what's out there. And it's just a lot to research. So I feel like I'm not always doing my due diligence, but I do try. So we'll talk about a practice called bacha bazi, which is in the Middle East, primarily in Afghanistan. This is a practice in which young boys are kidnapped by a group of men and forced to wear dresses and dance for men before being raped. Now, governments and even the Taliban outlaw this practice because it is, in their opinion, homosexuality, which is against the law. However, it is rarely enforced under the law as many powerful men engage in this activity, which allows the practice to continue. During the documentary, this is what winning looks like. Ben Anderson films a U.S. Marine speaking to a police chief about the practice, in which he states that it is not an act of homosexuality, rather it is a part of their culture. And remember this when I address issues related to circumcision. Additionally, he claimed this act is consensual and the boys want it to happen, and was further quoted, "If my commanders don't fuck the asses of these boys, what should they fuck? The pussies of their own grandmothers?" From 2010 to 2016, the U.S. military reported nearly 6,000 acts of human rights violations in Afghanistan, primarily that of boys being raped. This report should have caused America to cut off aid, but no such action occurred. Instead, the U.S. military took the stance of ignoring it, and any soldier who made any complaints of it had their careers ruined. This included Captain Dan Quinn and First Class Charles Martin, who beat up an Afghan commander who had a boy chained to his bed, and Captain Dan Quinn lost his commission as a result. But let's not forget Michelle Obama, who talked about bring our girls back. Where was the outcry for the boys in the Middle East?
Might always say, just staying on the Boko Haram, for all the girls that were kidnapped, there were far more boys and men who were killed. Sometimes but locked in churches, and which are satellite. And it's the same point you're making, Chris. Absolutely no outcry, vanishingly little interest or coverage of it.
And I will be discussing Boko Haram when I discuss children's death.
Okay.
And also child soldiers as well. Hijaras. This one really makes me depressed. Like, writing this book, I often have to take breaks for several days because it just makes me so sad. And I'm not kidding. I'm being quite serious. An even worse instance of non-custodial abduction is that of boys in India. Hijaras is another word for eunuch, which is the removal of the penis of boys and men, often against their will. This practice is believed to have originated in China, but was something done throughout history. For most of the modern world, it is not something practiced except in places of South Asia, primarily India. This does happen to boys, but it can also happen to young men. Not too much is known about the practice, but some sources state that little boys are kidnapped, given opium, their genitals removed, a stick placed in their abdomen so as not to allow the healing to close the area, given no water to prevent urination, and if they survive all of that, they are celebrated as hijaras. Some houses of hijaras will require that a boy injure his ass so that he bleeds, having his first menstruation. They can return home, though some are auctioned off. God, I kind of feel like some tingling in my eyes right now just reading that. It is believed that there are as many as 2 million hijaras in India, to the point that the Indian government recognized hijaras as a third gender. However, more than just the forced removal of the genitals, they are considered the lowest of caste and have little opportunity to find work unless they become sex workers, and are often beaten by people who look down on them. They're forced to engage in homosexuality, further asked to be used for sex, and some men don't perceive it as homosexuality when having sex with hijaras, as only one of them is doing the penetration. And a point that I make into this is, why would anyone knowingly choose this lifestyle? I mean, they're the lowest of the lows in their society. They're abused. And you're telling me that there are boys who volunteer for this? No. And, I mean, they deserve human rights protection. I mean, boys do, period. But if someone was forced to deal with this, then they need help. But I'm a little bit miffed that they were considered a third gender under Indian law, because honestly, to me, that just encourages the practice. Yeah, that's exactly how I feel.
And I guess some people would be making money out of these unfortunates. In the same way, in some, I went to India as a 14-year-old. I mean, almost 50 years ago, and back then, and I'm sure well before that, there were sort of children who had their legs broken, so that they could earn more from begging. But how much of that is driven by extreme poverty, and how much out of lack of concern? It's a toxic mix for sure.
Well, moving past that, we're going to talk about abuse. And while technically that was also about abuse, this is more domestic abuse in the home or in society. And I'll read this poem by Antoine Fisher, which, if you get the chance, check out the movie of the same name, Antoine Fisher. It's about, it's a true story about a man who's in the Navy, a young man, who has a lot of disciplinary problems. And he's forced to go see a therapist where he talks about his whole life of being born basically in the foster care system and how he suffered a series of abuses as a child. It is a quite telling movie that very few movies have ever really featured the abuse that boys suffer. So it also has Denzel Washington in it. He plays the therapist. Who will cry for the little boy, lost and all alone? Who will cry for the little boy, abandoned without his own? Who will cry for the little boy? He cried himself to sleep. Who will cry for the little boy he never had for keeps? Who will cry for the little boy? He walked the burning sand. Who will cry for the little boy, the boy inside the man? Who will cry for the little boy who knows well hurt and pain? Who will cry for the little boy? He died and died again. Who will cry for the little boy, a good boy he tried to be? Who will cry for the little boy who cries inside of me? And if I keep reading this, I might actually cry on the air. So both boys and girls experience abuse in their childhood, often by their parents. We recognize as a society that abusing children is bad, but like most things, we tend to focus on when girls are abused versus when boys are abused. This is especially true when, as adults, women who have committed a bad action will have their childhood brought up by the media as a way to justify criminal actions. She was abused as a child. Whereas for boys, abuse is par for the course, and it can never be used as a justification for later bad behavior. Simply put, men bad, women good. So I'm going to skip past a couple of this. This talks more about the definition of what abuse is. I will use the term child maltreatment in place of abuse in places, but it basically means the same thing. So let's talk about the perpetrators and victims. The abuse may be brief, but the trauma lasts a lifetime.
What does SPCC stand for, Chris?
I forget offhand.
Okay, sorry for asking in that case.
That's okay. I probably should put it in there. I'll just make a note of this. What does this mean? So I do have a bit of bias when it comes to this. I did have an abusive father. And I do want to call it out to say, hey, this happened to me, so this does affect me. So if you think that I'm misinterpreting anything, well, there you go. Now, despite what is commonly believed, most perpetrators of child abuse are in fact mothers. It's not to say that fathers can't be abusers, as my childhood demonstrates. But odds are children are more likely to receive abuse from their mothers. And this is a chart in 2019 from Child Maltreatment. It's a yearly report that's been published, I want to say, since 1996. And pretty much every year it has shown the same basic information. It just updates with new data from agencies across the United States. Now, the first thing to note is the top part is for parent and the bottom part is non-parent. Total non-parent cases is almost 92,000, whereas total parents is almost 600,000. So more parents commit abuse than non-parents. But the highest one at 39% is 252,000 by mothers. And then an additional 41,000 by a mother and a non-parent, such as a stepfather or a boyfriend, a live-in boyfriend. And, I mean, that is actually a point of conversation to have, is that when it comes to abusing children, step-parents are more likely to abuse than the birth father, the biological father. So, but when we look at fathers, I mean, we're talking about 22% of fathers commit abuse, or 22% of cases that this reports was from fathers only, and an additional 7,000 of father and non-parent, like a stepmother. Now it says 2 parents of known sex. This is supposed to be, they started this year in 2019. It's supposed to be mother and father together who are committing abuse. But in this, they include same-sex couples. But for the majority of it, it is a mother and father, which do commit a high rate of abuse, almost equal to fathers only. So, I mean, what we can take away from this is that, for the most part, mothers are the primary abuser of children. But we don't talk about that, ever. We only talk about abuse if it's a father doing it to a girl. And this is a quote that I created, is, if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse one. Because it's not just the parents abusing the children, it's also society's ignoring the practice of it happening. Now, in understanding perpetrators and trying to find a cause for abuse, a number of behavioral characteristics have been linked. Parents who physically abuse their children or neglect them are more likely to have low self-esteem, poor impulse control, and antisocial behavior. Neglectful parents specifically may also have difficulty with life decisions such as marriage, having children, or seeking or staying employed. Abusive parents are likely to have unrealistic expectations of how to care for their children, resulting in irritations and annoyances in response to children's behavior as a result of expectations not being met by the children, with further results in being less supportive, affectionate, playful, and responsive to children's needs. You hear the saying, not everyone should be a parent. Well, those that would fit into the category are more likely to be abusive to their children. So let's talk about the victims. Most presume that overwhelmingly the victims of child maltreatment are female. Much of the research in this area tends to push for that concept, that they tend to identify gender when females are the majority of victims. But when nearly equal or boys are the majority of victims, many studies will try to hide gender by using non-gender terms. It is difficult to find studies that target boys specifically done in the last 20 years, often requiring going back 30 or 50 years. They may very well be out there, but they're lost in the sea of studies that are gynocentrically biased. Starting with age, the younger a child is, the more likely they will suffer abuse, with 77% of all victims being 5 and under, and 26% being under the age of 1. Of all children who suffer maltreatment, 85% suffer only one maltreatment, with 61% of those single abuses are neglect, 10% are physical, and 7% is sexual. And I will break from here and say that one of the things that I found in my research, which actually shocked me, is as much as the media reports on sexual abuse of children, it generally only represents about 10% of all reported cases of abuse. 10%, and yet the media is so focused on it. I thought it was much higher. And the number one form of abuse that children suffer is actually neglect at 75%. And yet it is rarely talked about.
I wonder if I might just add something here, Chris, on the sexual abuse of boys. I'm reminded of studies from both California and the UK, and the particular study that comes to mind, I think, was in the 1980s, where a couple of researchers called Petrovich and Templar interviewed convicted, obviously convicted male rapists in a jail in California, and they found that 58% of them had been sexually abused when they were boys by one or more women, sometimes their own mothers. And a study in a British prison that was reported a year or two ago found an almost identical figure. So it would seem that, you know, to stop rapists, we need to stop women abusing boys, never mind teaching men not to rape. So it's quite clear that there's a significant revenge factor in some very damaged men, and men damaged by women. Let's be blunt about it.
I am very familiar with that. Unfortunately, it was a rather small sample size. It was only about 88 male prisoners that they interviewed in California, but it is significant. I don't want to diminish it. But I have also seen a similar research done in female sex offenders, female rapists, and they were also sexually abused when they were children. It's just this continuous repeat cycle. But the difference here is women are not fully recognized as being sexual predators of children, whereas men, we throw the book at them. We lock them up, throw away the key, and talk about how we want to kill them. And yet when a woman does it, it's almost like we're praising the children, like, you're so lucky that this has happened to you. Now, rape across the board is bad, and we need to address the concerns that it happens to boys and girls. But the first step is acknowledging that it happens to boys.
Absolutely. And one of the things we had in our 2015 election manifesto, Chris, was some data from the States, from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, I think. And so they looked at female abuse of males, sexual abuse, I'm talking here, and men's abuse of women. And they found something between 35 and 40% of abuse, of heterosexual abuse, was carried out by women, you know, and on their own. So we would expect convictions to you know, in an ideal world, to reflect that. But the reality in the particular year, whatever that was that for every woman who was convicted for sexual abuse of the opposite sex, I think it was 213 or 220 men were convicted. That's the scale of this. I know this isn't children I'm talking about, but it's all part of the same picture, of course, Chris.
Yes, it very much is, and that's why I've started off with children. And this book is going to be called Foundation, because what happens to children carries with us into adulthood. In fact, I have a very specific report that I'm looking forward to talking about in this video that expresses exactly that. But just for a quick point, when it comes to abuse, the total number of articles I have related to this that is non-sexual abuse is 481. But for sexual abuse of children, is 754. There's so much on this subject, and yet it represents a minority of all abuses. Doesn't mean that we need to talk about it less, but we should really put it into the full context of everything that's going on, both for children and adults. Now, this report, when it talks about the victims, it states that 51.4% of child maltreatment victims are girls, and boys are 48.6%. Now, a lot of takeaway people have, the blue pillars and feminists will say, well, the majority are girls. Well, that's technically true, but we're talking about a difference of 2.8%. And we also live in a world where boys don't really get reported for the abuses they suffer. Because, again, we focus more on girls. But even then, I'm still willing to concede that it's pretty much 50-50. Boys and girls are affected. And I don't shy away from reporting on things that are happening to girls in my pursuit of what's happening to boys. Because we're not going to play the feminist game where we try to erase victims. We're going to acknowledge victims across the board.
But the reality is that if girls were 10% of the victims and boys 90%, there would still be an overwhelming concern for those girls.
Which is what happens in sexual abuse.
You're right. Right.
Now, I'll go through this section real quickly. There are actually many more types of abuses that I reported, but these are the major ones. Neglect, which is the lack of basic needs that are not being met. Unlike physical or sexual abuse where something is actually done, neglect is the failure to do something. The general definition is a failure of an authority figure of children, generally a parent, to provide amenities which can include food, clothing, shelter, health services, safety, and proper discipline. And note that I said properly disciplined and not improper discipline, which is a form of physical or psychological abuse. And we got to remember that discipline is a necessary part of growing up. Signs of neglect for children are those who are often sleepy, dirty, have poor hygiene, poorly dressed for weather conditions, wearing the same clothing often, depressed, withdrawn or antisocial, destructive behavior, substance abuse problems, poor living conditions, and inadequate medical or dental care. This may also include begging for food and money and or stealing. Now, it's possible for there to be a false positive that one of these by themselves is not indicative of neglect. That's why you kind of have to investigate it and not just make the assumption that there's a problem. And then I also mentioned Antoine Fisher again, the movie. Then we also have physical abuse, medical neglect, which is difficult to determine as this may be the results of parents being ignorant or of the importance of modern medicine, to not caring or simply lacking insurance or transportation. Negligence doesn't necessarily require a parent to have the motive to harm their child, but it is hard to hold a parent in contempt if they cannot afford the means to properly care for their child, especially in the U.S. when health insurance rates can easily increase over time. We also got educational neglect, primarily when parents don't put their children in school. That's pretty much what it is. Or another aspect of educational neglect is the teacher's inability to recognize children suffering from abuse. Teachers spend a great deal of time with children outside their homes and can see indicators that might represent a bad home environment for children. Sudden drop in the homework or test scores can often be an indicator of something going on. In addition to maltreated children tend to do poorly in language and math, compared to non-maltreated children. Parents' lack of involvement in their children's education or low aspiration is equally a cause of concern. But it's also difficult to report abuse. We also got emotional and also we got emotional and psychological. I separate these issues, but a lot of reports put them together, so it's a little difficult to talk about this. But it's basically when a parent has difficulty accepting a child's identity or if they have a disability. Parents often have certain aspirations for their children even before they're born, and the child's failure to meet expectation can result in refusing to nurture their child. This can be especially true for tigering parents or helicopter parents who want their children to achieve academically or to do well in sports. When children achieve the level of success their parents desire, they are praised, but when they fail to live up to their standards, they are shunned. Supervisory or leaving children unsupervised is another common form of abuse. We also have physical abuse, which I go into greater detail. And psychological. Gaslighting is actually a very common form of psychological abuse. And one notable example of this is Family 05, where they basically tortured their children to make money on YouTube. And there was a case in which they made a mess on Cody's, the youngest son, bedroom floor, then accused the child of making that mess. They began to berate the child for the mess and his subsequent denial of it, threatening punishment. The child was in tears. After some time, they revealed that it was a prank, that the child and he should calm down and equally laugh it off, which he wasn't able to do, and was screaming at his parent for being horrible in how they treated him. It's like, come on, it's a joke, laugh it off, it's not a big deal. Fortunately, they were taken down, and they, I believe the children got taken away. So here's the rates of abuse. Like I said, 75% is neglect, 18% is physical, 10% is sexual, 6% is psychological, 2% is medical, and less than 1% is actual sex trafficking. I know feminists really love to make a big issue about sex trafficking. And as Christina Hoff Sommers has reported on The Factual Feminist, it's not as big of an issue as people want to make it out to be. Still requires some serious focus, but it represents less than 1% of all actual abuses. Anything that you want to jump in on, Mike?
No, that's fine, Chris. You carry on.
Okay, so let's talk about fatal abuse or death of children through abuse. Abuses such as physical and neglect can lead to death, but others such as psychological doesn't necessarily lead to death, at least not in a direct way. Even though over time someone could die as a result of an abuse suffered at an early age, like suicide, fatal abuse focuses on death that occurs as a direct result of abuse. So here's another chart from that report, child maltreatment. And here we can see that 58% of children who died as a result of abuse were boys. So it's nearly a 60-40 split. So boys are more likely to die as a result of abuse. In 2019, 70% of the deaths were under the 3 years of age, and 45% were were younger than 12 months. So worse is even that children's deaths are not routinely investigated, and autopsies of bodies are not always carried out. Now, you might say poorer countries have less resources, but this is seen in wealthy countries as well. Around the world, there's a problem in recognizing cases of infanticide and are just as likely misclassified, with later reinvestigation ruling homicide. As such, the number of children of homicide worldwide is around 14,000, but it's likely to be much higher due to underreporting or lack of investigation.
I'd just like to say one thing here, Chris. I don't know about the situation in the States, but I mean, the infanticide, the killing of babies and infants by women, has pretty well been decriminalized in the UK, and I believe in other countries as well, because inevitably the mental health issue thing gets trotted out, and that's it. You know, well, a defense that men could never use.
Well, it's good that you said that, because I actually have a number of cases, some of the worst that I've seen, and this only represents a very small sample size, but Ghana de Bros, 3, was tortured to death by his mother. Florida Family Services basically had run-ins with the mother in the past, including battery against the boy's father, and would threaten to throw the child at the father. The father also committed domestic violence against the mother. So they knew that this was a problem home, and they still let the child live there until the mother killed the child. And I linked to all of these so you can see where I got them from. Malachi Lawson, 4, was reported missing by the mother to police until she confessed that her and her female partner were responsible for the death of their son. Rua Candido, 9, was murdered by his mother and her female partner after botching a procedure at home of the removal of the penis in an attempt to turn him into a girl. The body was reported to have been decapitated and the skin removed from trying to use a barbecue grill to dispose of evidence. Zachary Andrew Turner. There's actually a documentary on Amazon called Dear Zachary. And what the documentary was originally supposed to be a video for Zachary about his father, which his mother killed his father. But she was in Newfoundland, and there was this whole legal issue. She wasn't actually arrested, but she was supposed to go on trial. But she was still able to live with the child. And the state basically said, Newfoundland basically said, that, well, she's only a danger to men that she's in love with. And since she's not in love with any men, she's not a danger to society. And very long story short, she eventually took her 1-year-old son, drugged him, and then swam out into the ocean, and they both drowned because she couldn't face the possibility of losing her child to the parents of the man she killed. So I won't read all of these because there's quite a bit to go through. And I'm sure someone out there will be like, well, you're just focusing on lesbians, and Chris Bodie thinks lesbians murder their children. No, I don't. First off, I reported 12 boys who died by their mother. The fact that 2 of the reports were lesbian is inconsequential. That's why I said female partner instead. I just picked out, it should be 12, not 8, because I originally had 8. I picked out 12 horrible cases I found, and I picked female perpetrators out of fear that if I had a male perpetrator, it would be bias people into thinking, yeah, men are bad. Yes, I went for shock value in hopes that it wakes people up to reality. So, okay, this is what I was looking for. So this is child fatalities by relationships. And once again, when we look at the highest number, it is mothers only at 29.2%. An additional 10% when it's a mother and non-parent. Versus fathers, who constitute about 15% with father and father with non-parent, versus the near 40%. And the conclusion I draw from this is that the majority of children likely to die are boys, and the most likely perpetrator is mothers. And this isn't just stuff I'm making up. This isn't like, oh, I saw this once and I'm reporting on it. I'm showing you where I got my work. This is a government agency reporting on this. So here's a part that I really want to read about, the problem of being a male victim. And what I discuss in here, I think, is groundbreaking. And this really needs to be discussed a lot more. The great thing about children is neuroplasty, the ability for their brain to overcome and heal from negative events in their lives, so long as they're given necessary support to recover. Should a child experience abuse and get treatment for it before reaching adulthood, chances are good that they will go on to have a healthy life. Lacking treatment or having to delay until adulthood for treatment can result in many problems that will be detrimental to their livelihood. The problem of being a male victim pretty much starts with the brain in our infancy. While many social justice warriors would claim that there's no difference between males and females, there are in fact distinction between male brains and female brains. Female brains tend to mature faster than males by at least 2 years. An 8-year-old girl is as mature as a 10-year-old boy. This remains true until boys enter puberty in their teens and eventually surpass girls mentally in adulthood. This isn't a denigration of boys. This is just a simple biological fact. At birth, boys tend to smile less than girls and are more irritable. Males also engage in less self-comfort and less excitement. Girls appear to be less vulnerable to interactive stress. Boys are more likely to be emotionally reactive when they see their mother's face, to use facial expressions, to be angry or fussy, or desire to be picked up more, all of which indicates that boys have greater difficulty with self-regulating their affective state. Now, the study that I reference does not take into consideration if boys were circumcised, which may be an explanation of why boys are more likely to do this. What we can draw from this is that not only do male brains develop slower than girls, but they are more susceptible to trauma than girls are. This is seen in that girls from birth onto emotional maturity handle stress better than boys, until adulthood when men surpass women. Now, in our culture, more focus is put on females and more resources are given for any trauma they endure. Whereas for boys, they are told to man up or suppress their emotions, essentially being denied the help they need in handling their trauma, which has been demonstrated they need extra help due to a slower developed brain. Beyond not receiving the help they need from family and schools, male victims of abuse have reported frustration and anger of not seeing their experience represented in public discussions or media, whereas girls' stories are told. Studies done in the name of equality tend to erase male victims or passively mention them with more focus on females. Therapists or counselors tend to apply a female-centric model of victimization when addressing their male patients, resulting in failure to get the help they need. And, talk to Paul Elam and Tom Golden. They can tell you 100%, I'm 100% correct on that last paragraph. So not only are boys more likely to be victims of abuse, they are most likely not to receive help for their problems, which results in some type of psychological or emotional problems in adulthood, to which their behavior is attributed to toxic masculinity or the fault of testosterone. Ironic, isn't it? Females dislike the stigma that any emotions they have is attributed to their hormones, but have no problem equating bad male behavior to theirs. What did I link right there? Mouse. So, later effects. When discussing the later effects of abuse and maltreatment, or I forget what ACE stands for.
Adverse childhood experiences.
Thank you. One will note the lack of direct correlation, or rather, correlation does not imply causation. It's hard to pinpoint what is the direct result of suffering abuse as a child, as everyone tends to have a different reaction. Some living healthy, normal lives, not experiencing any problems at all, or not being aware that they are actually suffering a problem, choosing to ignore it or consider it normal. The best we can do is show patterns of behaviors and extrapolate what effects one is most likely to have as a result of abuses, based on one of the following reasons: health-harming behaviors, social detriments of health, or neurological genetic pathways. So some of this stuff, and I actually got this from some UK sources. 4 times more likely to have diabetes, 3 times more.
Sorry, Chris, can I interrupt you here? Sorry, sure. Are we saying that boys are 4 times more likely?
This is just survivors of abuse in general, not just boys.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Yes. Okay.
Because it's hard to, again, the studies don't often focus on one gender or another, or if they do, it's on females.
Sure.
This was across the board.
Okay.
3 times more likely to develop heart disease, 3 times more likely to develop respiratory disease, up to 20 years reduced life expectancy, 6 times more likely to receive treatment for mental illness within lifetime, nearly 10 times more likely to have felt suicidal or engage in self-harm within lifetime, more likely to commit domestic violence, 7 times to be an active smoker, 6 times more likely to be obese. I mean, the list just goes on and on.
And of course, Chris, a lot of these are linked, aren't they? So I know from personal experience. I mean, I'm diabetic, and that's because I, spent so many years obese. So there's a lot of cross linkage in these things.
I didn't know that about you. I thought you were always this handsome.
Time to go to the optician again, Chris, for a new test.
So, I mean, yeah, this is kind of generalized, but as my previous things that I've mentioned, that boys are more likely to suffer abuse as children and grow up. And it's like we look at all of these toxic behaviors of men, and it's like, well, we can kind of show where it came from. They were abused as children. And yet when media reports, it's always man commits murder because he's a man. Well, woman commits murder because she was sexually abused as a child. We should have pity for her.
It's probably also worth adding, Chris, that we see it in the UK, and I'm sure you do in the States all the time, that claims are made of abuse. And my understanding is that they aren't routinely investigated. So so lawyers will simply advise a client to claim they were the victims of typically domestic violence, and and the court just buys that. So it's just one of many excuses to give women suspended sentences. We had one the other day where a woman had a suspended sentence for something that a man would have got 5 or 10 years in jail for, and the female judge said that, well, she was, when the incident happened, I think her baby was 4 months old. So her hormones must have been raging. Suspended sentence, or in plain English, no punishment.
Well, I'm thinking about a recent article I just read a few days ago. In Australia, some boys were playing soccer, and after they won, they were screaming and shouting in the locker room. And a female teacher walked into the locker room, which they call it a changing room, and yelled at them, telling them that they were being toxic and sexist, which they weren't. But think about that. And the article didn't even really focus on this, but it's like a female walked into a male locker room. How many of them were changing? How many of them might have been taking showers? Reverse the genders. A male teacher walks into a female locker room. He would have been arrested immediately.
Well, his career will be over. His career will be over.
Yeah. So, we've been doing this for about an hour. I kind of want to go a half an hour more. So I'm just going to go through some of this other stuff real quickly. But this is on child labor. And a 2013 sample of nearly 170,000 children found that 60% were boys. And 72% of all boys and girls were between the ages of 5 and 14. This is an issue that's not really discussed a whole lot, in the world. And here's a good picture of this, of the different countries around the world. Light blue is female, dark blue is male. Now, in some places like Bolivia, it's near parity. But many places, such as Guatemala, males double females. Now, it's bad when it happens to both, but again, we primarily focus on girls, and more specifically, sex trafficking, which is included in child labor. Girls forced to have sex, that's where the focus is on. And again, we said that sex trafficking represents less than 1% of abuse. And yet child labor is such a big issue, but we don't discuss when it happens to males. I list a whole lot of the different types of trade that children are often hired into or forced into, such as alcohol, bamboo, bananas, blueberries, charcoal, coffee, grapes, hogs, leather, silk, vanilla. It's quite possible that many of the products that you have used were made by children. And this is not even talking about, well, this also includes sweatshops, but that's not the majority of child labor. And there's dangers, there's tasks to prevent it. The way we can prevent it is modern technology leads to unemployment of otherwise unskilled workers. As technology improves, it displaces adults who can work. So often they need their children to go out and take care of the family. Other businesses that can't afford new technology will hire children to compensate. So to compete with these big businesses, so these are basically the two causes of child labor. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but now I've started writing this section here, so it's not really complete. But in 2015, it was estimated that 300,000 children served in the military, with 60% being boys. The
And you
uses
can
of
bet,
children.
sorry, 60% being boys. You can bet that virtually 100% of the kids at serious risk would have been boys.
How do you mean?
That in roles, of course. I mean, there's a whole spectrum from pretty safe to very dangerous in the military. And what I'm saying is that as you head in the direction of more dangerous, the boys will feature more and more as a percentage. That's for sure. I mean, the 60% is a very blunt sort of figure. So you can imagine girls being involved in things like cooking and so on, rather than anything anywhere near the front line, for example.
Well, I actually kind of discussed that a little bit. The reason why militaries like to use children, because you're thinking, hey, they can't fight, they're not adults. They're easy to capture, easy to manipulate. They don't eat much food. They don't get paid. Don't have a highly developed sense of fear. And those in a position of power can turn them into sexual slaves. And not just girls, but boys too. We talked about bachabazi. This is done by the military in the Middle East, where they will capture boys to use as sex slaves. Whether child or adult, those who serve in armed conflict can suffer psychiatric illnesses. The children are more susceptible to mental illness as their brains are not fully developed and have a more difficult time adapting to situations, which also includes what I mentioned in abuse, that they're more susceptible to abuse. Recruitment of child soldiers is either done through a civilian broker who is paid to recruit children, or in some cases by soldiers. Leaving the military is difficult and often requires recruiting 3 to 5 other soldiers to take one soldier's place. Oh, this really pissed me off. Unfortunately, while most people believe child soldiers are only males, government agencies, including the United States nations, tend to focus on girls used in the military, having the headlines of 4 out of 10 child soldiers are female. A UN report, and their focus was 4 out of 10 are female. It's like that homeless commercial I saw, that 1 out of 4 homeless people are female. Well, guess what the other 3 are? Men. But of course, the UN, their only concern is girls and women. So the rest is just some research that I haven't quite incorporated yet into my book. As you can see, I am using the Empathy Gap book and website.
Very good book.
I have it right here. So some quick things about circumcision. In 2010, 60% of boys were circumcised.
It's a figure that's met with horror outside the US, I can tell you.
Actually, I think I have. Oh, yeah. 75% of males in the first world countries are intact and suffer no medical problems as a result. U.S. is one of the first world countries that still practice MGM. There is also a strong suggestion between circumcision and autism, which is 5 times higher in boys than girls. And
you mentioned early on about the impact of circumcision on the brain, very quickly, Chris. And I know some years ago there was a study done where a baby was put in a scanner pre-circumcision, and then the circumcision and scanned, the head scanned at least, and then the circumcision carried out with a non-metallic blade, obsidian, I think, because you couldn't use something metallic in that with the scanner. A change was and then scanned again, and the change was visible in the brain, which was still there months later, and was assumed by the by the researchers to be permanent. I mean, this is permanent brain damage caused on sometimes on 8-day-old babies.
Well, I actually have something that not mentioned that specifically. I'll have to go look that up. But circumcised infants show a stronger pain response to subsequent routine vaccinations than uncircumcised infants. Any amount of pain.
Is it cortisol, which is a stress hormone? And I believe after circumcision, babies have raised levels of cortisol for something like a year or 18 months. It is so traumatic. I mean, very often, some religious defenders in particular will say that it's so painless that the baby goes quiet. Now, what happens? It goes into shock. It passes out because the pain is unendurable.
Well, and I remember a report I was reading that in the 80s, they tried to say that babies don't feel pain.
Yes.
And when they cry as a result of pain, they're just kind of mimicking the behavior they should be doing, but they don't actually feel pain.
I think
it's perfectly okay to do it.
I think they were saying it was surprise. But within living memory, babies after birth had surgery, major surgery inside their bodies carried out, because they were reluctant to give general anesthetics to babies, understandably, and they actually did. The medical consensus was that those babies didn't feel pain. Can you believe it?
Yeah. So now, for me, my hypothesis, which I can sort of show, is that the reason why circumcision is so prevalent in the United States is because it can be sold for a lot of money. And I found 2 reports that said that foreskin tissue is found in cosmetic products and can be purchased for at least $1,000, which I imagine that price is increasing as the rate of circumcision goes down every year.
I would have thought sorry, Chris, I would have thought a bigger driver would be doctors earning money from this butchery.
Well, I don't think it's doctors specifically that are earning money from it. It's the hospitals.
Okay, well, whatever. I would think that's driving more of it. But sorry, go on.
In 1999, Medicaid performed 310,000 circumcisions, costing taxpayers, adjusted for inflation of 2019, $53 million. So much of our tax money is being used for infant circumcision. So not only is our money being wasted, then the doctors turn around, or the hospital turns around and sells it. And this is why the American Pediatric Association, wherever it's called, doesn't want to give up the practice, because then they'd lose out on all of that money. Consider the number of males that are born every year. And let's use simple math. We'll say 100 male babies are born every year. I'm sure it's a lot more. 60% are circumcised, so 60 babies. And it can be sold up to $10,000. That's $600,000 that is made right there. And I use very simple math to get there. So there's a lot more that I have on circumcision. It's probably the one issue that I have the most resources on. Of course, we got mental health problems, being overdiagnosed with ADHD, higher rates of suicide among boys than girls, in many cases as much as 4 times as many. And of course, I've got sex abuse, and this is the same report again for child maltreatment of sex trafficking by relation to their parents. And the biggest number of all is 52 of mothers at 7% of total cases. So of all parents, it's almost twice as likely that mothers are responsible for the trafficking of their children than fathers are. No one wants to talk about that. And yes, fathers are more likely to rape their daughters. Mothers are more likely to rape their sons. But again, we don't recognize that mothers can be pedophiles.
Well, of course, I mean that's one of the great taboos, isn't it? Which women exploit by going into teaching and primary school teaching and secondary school teaching.
So there's a report called the Invisible Boy Report, which, by the way, teachers, that is greatly ignored, but I have so many resources on. When it comes to sexual abuse, the most I have is on teachers abusing boys. And so often it is a slap on the wrist for those teachers. Many of them don't serve any jail time whatsoever. There's a really great report on this from Canada called the Invisible Boy Report. It's a little bit dated, but it still has a lot of really good information in it. So we got about 15 more minutes, so I'm going to go through education real quick. And this book will consist of childhood and education leading up to college, which is the beginning of adulthood. And then other books will cover things that relate specifically to men more. But education. The educated differ from the uneducated as much as the living differs from the dead, Aristotle. So elementary and middle school teachers are 80% female. And this is discussed often that most likely, out of all single parents, 80% are mothers. And then children go to school and like 80% of their teachers are female. And it's a concern because these boys are not getting the proper male support they need, the male mentors, the male role models. And they look for it and they often find it in the worst places possible. So this is really a concern. Nearly 70% of boys who are bullied based on their gender were boys. But again, boys will be boys. No one wants to talk about that issue. In fact, I was having a conversation not too long ago about this on the problem with bullying. And the only time children get in trouble when it comes to bullying is when a male victim retaliates. Like he's being pushed around so much, he turns around and pushes back. Boom, they're both in trouble. I mean, that happened to me when I was a child. I was in 6th grade, and one of my classmates one day just decided he wanted to start picking on me and kept pushing me around. And finally, I turned around and I pushed him back and I pushed him down. And then a teacher's aide came over and it's like, "What's going on?" I'm like, "He was harassing me, so I retaliated." And she's like, "Well, what should you have done in that situation?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" And she says, "School policy says if someone is harassing you, you walk away." Are you fucking kidding me? Walk away? You walk away, all they're going to do is keep bothering you. In fact, if you turn your back on someone, that gives them open opportunity to attack your weak point. But that's what I was told as a child. You walk away from a conflict. I don't think we take school bullying serious enough. Boys more likely to be diagnosed for ADHD, especially by teachers. 21% of boys are falling behind girls in math due to female teacher bias towards female students. 9% of male students were expelled from school compared to 4% of female students. There's just all sorts of stuff on this subject that we're not really talking about it. For every 100 girls who repeat kindergarten, 194 boys repeat kindergarten. Boys are more likely to repeat a grade than girls are. I'm going to skip past some of this so I can get to some other areas. Pell Grant funding for men needs to be dramatically improved as men receive $6 billion less each year. In the last 5 years, Pell has spent over $30 million more on women attending 4-year college programs. So Pell Grant is just one of those things that we can get to kind of help us attend college. But I mean, they spend $30 billion more on women to go to college than men. And yet no one is concerned that male enrollment is down. No one's concerned that the graduation rate is down for men.
Can I just make a comment? Sorry, Chris, if you can just go back up to the Pell Grant thing.
Sure.
I see that statement. We shouldn't lower support for females, but increase support for males. I think the sentiment is a noble one. But at the end of the day, there's no magic money tree. So I mean, in the UK, for example, people who are trying to get money for male victims of domestic violence keep saying that the money for female victims shouldn't be reduced. Well, that's all very well, but where's this money going to come from?
You're 100% right.
I personally have no problem at all in saying no, that the money for women's programs needs to be reduced, to fund men's programs.
No, I'm 100% right there with you. When it's written in green, I basically have copied this from somewhere.
Okay.
So these are not my actual words. These are just research points that I need to look up to get the info for.
Okay, fair enough.
But you are 100% right. And, even things with like cancer research funding.
Yeah.
There's a big disparity right there. And, when it comes to like breast cancer versus prostate cancer, women have very good odds of surviving breast cancer, getting the medical treatment they need, but males are less likely to survive. And yeah, we would have to cut some funding for women to help men, but it would only make sense. At anything, it should be 50-50.
Yeah, right. Well, in the UK, at least, more men die of prostate cancer than women die of breast cancer. And a major study has just shown that the national screening program for cervical cancer is completely ineffective. If it didn't exist, no more women would have died. So the obvious thing is, well, let's put that money into prostate cancer screening. And of course, there's not one politician who's seeking that.
And more specifically with that, we need an early detection system for prostate cancer, because the problem with prostate cancer is it can take many years for it to become a problem, that many people actually have it and are not aware that they have it. But by the time that they show symptoms, it can often be too late.
Indeed. I think, to my mind, men over maybe 40 or certainly 50 should have annual PSA tests. Just a regular blood test. It couldn't. Very, very cheap.
In the top 100 high schools in the U.S., 72% of females graduated, while 65% of males graduated. It is predicted in 2026 that 57% of college students will be female. Now, this is a statistic I did myself. Since 1980, U.S. women have earned 13 million more degrees than men. Imagine if this was reversed, how feminists would be decrying, like, this is so horrible. This is proof of a patriarchy. This is proof that we're being oppressed because men have done far more than we have. And yet, those unpolite word women will turn around and still say that they're being oppressed in college. 13 million more degrees, and they're being oppressed.
I'm puzzled by that stat at the top there. 50 by 2026, 50% of college students will be female. I thought the figure was already over 60.
Based on this report,
okay,
it states that it's at 57%. I think right now it's at 56%. There might be another report that says something differently, but this is from the education.
Certainly, if you plot, I know William Collins does this. If you plot the numbers of female students versus male students, I mean, the male students graph is just it's kind of like
looks like scissors.
It's a big X, Yeah.
Yeah, and 1980 is, and the reason why I mentioned that is that's where it was at parity, or it was at 50.
Interesting.
And then that's where the divergence happens.
Right.
Okay, so that about does it. This isn't everything that I'm going to do on this. I haven't gotten to this section, so it's not more filled out. I just put a lot of notes for myself. But I have, for education by itself, I have 1,200 resources related to education. That goes from primary school all the way up into college. And it is a very serious problem that's not being addressed.
And are you able to say something about the number of books that you're expecting and some sort of timescale on this project, Chris?
Well, it was supposed to be 4 books that I was going to be releasing, but I decided, because this was getting longer and longer, to cut this book in half. So I'm going to focus just on childhood and education, and I'm hoping to have this book released within the next couple of months. Unfortunately, with like COVID and all of that, it just makes this project a lot harder to complete.
Of course, yeah.
But at present, I have about 4 books planned, and I want to do even more after that, talk about specific topics. This is more of a generalized introduction to topics, so it won't cover everything. In fact, there's a lot in my research that I have not included in there because it would require a lot more time to analyze.
Right. Well, it's a fantastic project, Chris, and I wish you every success with it.
Well, that means a lot coming from you. For those who don't know, both me and Mike are in competing publishing businesses. We actually talk a lot. We're good friends. So, he actually gave me his blessings, like, go ahead. I hope you do better than me. So, but yes, that is a great compliment coming from you. And I do want to say that, yes, I am charging money for this, and I hope it does well. But that's not the primary reason I'm writing this. This is an idea that I've had since 2013, but it was only within the last few years that I ever thought that I should write it. Actually, it's Elizabeth's fault that I'm writing it.
There had to be a woman behind this, didn't there?
Oh, yeah. But I've been collecting this information for years. So, I kind of wish I wrote it back then, but I was just like, who am I to do it? I'm a nobody. And then I later learned I didn't need to be anybody to write it. I just had to write it. So.
Well, it's obviously fantastically well researched, and I hope it does well.
And, I do think the greats that came before me, William Collins and Warren Farrell, I almost called him William. I think I did. But, they have done, they set the bar. in all honesty. And I'm trying to raise the bar even further than that. I'm not saying I'm better than them. I'm just saying that I'm adding to what they have already done.
I mean, those books are great, Chris, but what they lack, of course, is a vampire on the cover.
My emergency toilet paper supply. But I don't know how well you can see this, but a lot of these books are specific to my research for this book. So I got things like Men 2 by Bettina Arndt. Is that how I say her name?
Yeah.
Okay. I also have The War Against Boys by Christina Hoff Sommers, Son of Feminism by Janice Fiamingo, Say Goodbye to Crazy by Polly Loam, and I can never say her name, Dr. Paltime?
Dr. Tara Palmatier.
Yes. So, okay, well, that's going to close us out today. I thank everyone for attending. I know this was a little bit long, and it was just me reading. But I hope that you've learned something, and I want you to share this out for International Boys Day, because there is just so much. I mean, I'm very active within the men's movement, and so is Mike here. And, you know, there's a lot of things we know, but there's a lot more that's happening out there that I found just researching this, that I think even in the men's movement, we need to start discussing these things. And that's why today of all days is so important. Much like International Men's Day, these conversations are not happening enough in this world. So I hope that not only have you learned something today, I hope that you have conversations about these things today.
Indeed. And well, thanks for having me on, Chris. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
And be sure to check out Mike's stuff. He anything you want to specifically mention? I don't feel right doing it for you.
No, just j4mb.org.uk. That's
one of these days I'll write on that page, although I'm not British. All right, everyone, take care. Happy International Boys Day, and be sure to share this out. Thank you so much.
Good.
Okay, it helps to hit the end broadcast, not leave studio.